If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now let's enjoy the story. The sun hung high above the small suburban neighborhood, a warm golden hue casting long shadows as the afternoon wore on. Michael Jennings, a black man in his mid-30s, pulled into the grocery store parking lot, his old sedan creaking slightly as he navigated the narrow lanes. It was a Saturday, busy as usual, and Michael had just finished a long work week. All he wanted was a quick stop for some groceries before heading home to his quiet apartment. As he scanned the lot, he noticed a space close to the entrance, prime real estate for a busy Saturday. He eased his car into the spot, parking neatly between the lines, trying to avoid the chaos that usually filled the parking lot on weekends. Just as he opened the door to step out, he heard the unmistakable screech of tires. The sound was jarring, and he turned just in time to see a white SUV cutting the corner too sharply and veering aggressively toward his parked car. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He quickly moved to the side, just in time to avoid a collision as the car slammed to a halt beside him. A woman behind the wheel rolled down her window, her face twisted in anger even before she fully stopped. Michael instinctively straightened, preparing himself for a confrontation he had learned to expect in the increasingly tense climate around racial relations in the country. The words that came next were a shock, even to him. "That was my spot," she shouted, jabbing a finger in his direction, her voice sharp with entitlement. Michael blinked, stunned at the sudden outburst. He hadn't seen anyone waiting, nor had he cut anyone off. The parking spot had been empty when he arrived. Still, he stayed calm, choosing not to escalate the situation. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't see you." "The spot was open when I got here," Michael said, his voice steady but confused. The woman, her face flushed red, slammed her door open and stormed toward him. She was small, but her presence felt overpowering, a simmering rage radiating off of her. Her voice was filled with venom as she came within inches of him. "You didn't see me? You people never see us, do you?" she spat, her breath hot with fury. The way she looked at him, the way she aimed her words, made his stomach churn. "You come into nice neighborhoods like this, and you ruin everything. You think you're entitled to take whatever you want." Michael's fists clenched, but he refused to raise his voice. He had seen this before. Racism in the most casual, insidious forms. People like her didn't care for the truth. They only cared about their perception of him. His mind raced for a solution, but his response was cool, controlled. "Ma'am, I'm just here to buy groceries. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. It's just a parking spot," he said, hoping his calmness would de-escalate the situation. But the woman wasn't done. She stepped closer, pushing into his personal space as she pointed a trembling finger at his chest. "Don't talk to me like that." Her voice was shrill, rising in pitch. "You people think you can just do whatever you want. I bet you don't even live around here, do you?" Michael stood motionless. His skin burned with anger, but he didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. He wasn't interested in giving her more fuel for her fire. "Where I live, it has nothing to do with this," he replied, trying to stay composed. "Of course it does," she snapped. "This is what happens when you let people like you move into our communities. You think you can just take whatever you want? Just waltz in and destroy everything." She threw her arms wide, her frustration and hatred rising with each word. Michael's mind was racing. He had tried to avoid this. He had tried to walk away. But the words, the insinuation, the racism, he could feel the heat of her anger, the unfairness of it all surging inside him. And then, without warning, she shoved him, a sudden sharp force in his back that sent him stumbling forward. His body went stiff, muscles locking. His heart hammered in his chest, the insult hitting him like a blow to the soul. He spun around to face her, his eyes burning with fury. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Michael snapped, his voice breaking through the tension. But she wasn't done. She stood her ground, staring at him with a look of utter disdain. "Oh, I'll do whatever I want," she seethed, her breath coming in heavy, angry bursts. "You think you can just walk away from me? You don't get to ignore me. I'm not done with you yet." The rage inside him was growing, but Michael knew the consequences. He had been here before. Black men standing up for themselves only to be made the villain in the eyes of the world. The last thing he wanted was to become the latest example of how a peaceful exchange could spiral into a confrontation that would paint him as the aggressor. "Lady, walk away before you do something you'll regret," he warned. But she didn't listen. She stepped even closer, so close that he could feel the heat of her breath on his face. "You don't tell me what to do," she screamed, her words laced with venom. "You're nothing but a." The words struck him in like a physical blow, its weight unbearable, and for a moment he was paralyzed. He had been called that before, but the sting never dulled. The deep racism embedded in her words hit him harder than anything else. Without warning, she raised her hand and slapped him, the sharp crack of the slap ringing out through the quiet parking lot. The pain on his face was instant. The slap was hard, humiliating, and loud. It wasn't just physical pain. It was the public spectacle she made of him, the violation of his dignity in front of others. His head snapped to the side as the sting burned his cheek. He stood frozen for a second, the shock of the slap still registering in his brain, before his muscles tensed. He couldn't let this go. He wouldn't be humiliated in front of everyone. Before he could stop himself, Michael raised his hand, not in retaliation, but as a response. His slap wasn't as hard, but it was enough to send her stumbling backward. It wasn't an act of rage. It was a message. She staggered back, clutching her cheek in disbelief, her face twisted with shock and anger. And then, it happened. You hit me!" she shrieked, her voice rising in pitch, full of indignation. "You're going to pay for this. Do you know who I am? You think you can put your hands on me? I'll ruin you." Her hysteria escalated. She screamed louder and louder, her face becoming a grotesque mask of fury. Her eyes darted around, looking for witnesses, anyone who could validate her claims. "He assaulted me. He hit me. This thug. This animal." Michael stood there, his fists clenched tightly, trying to maintain his composure, his breathing slow but steady. The anger inside him burned, but he kept his cool. The last thing he wanted was to escalate this further. He turned and started walking toward the store, determined to get on with his day, despite the chaos unfolding behind him. The woman continued to scream, but he didn't turn back. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Michael's heart was still pounding in his chest as he made his way through the sliding glass doors of the store. The automatic sensors had no idea of the emotional storm he was carrying inside. He had done what he could to keep his cool, but the sharp sting of humiliation still throbbed on his cheek where she had slapped him. His hands gripped the shopping cart tightly, knuckles white with the tension that refused to leave. Each step down the aisles felt like he was in a daze, detached from the mundane task of grocery shopping. His mind replayed the incident in a loop, trying to process it all. The parking spot, her aggression, the slap, and most of all, the way she had made it clear that she thought she was above him, that she had the right to treat him like an object, like he didn't belong there. It wasn't just about the parking space anymore. It was about his humanity, his dignity, and how easily someone could strip that away just because of the color of his skin. Michael gritted his teeth and tried to focus on his list: milk, eggs, bread, simple things, things that would have been an afterthought any other day. But today, everything felt heavy. The store's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a steady hum of normalcy that seemed so out of place after the chaos in the parking lot. Michael reached for a carton of milk, his fingers shaking as he placed it in his cart. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the memories of Karen's words, the way she had hurled them at him with such venom, still stung. The truth was, this wasn't the first time he'd been on the receiving end of this kind of treatment. He had grown up in neighborhoods where people like Karen had made it clear that he wasn't welcome. The insults had always been there, the subtle slights, the looks that lingered a little too long. He had learned to ignore them, to push them down, to focus on surviving. But today felt different. He was tired of walking on eggshells, tired of being the bigger person when people like Karen got to act with impunity. He was tired of carrying the weight of other people's hatred on his shoulders. Every slight, every insult, every shove, it added up. It wore on him. The hum of the store seemed to drown out the reality of the world outside. But Michael couldn't escape it. The world wasn't waiting for him to calm down. Karen wasn't going to just let it go. He could feel the bitterness rising in his chest. He hadn't started this fight, but now it felt like he couldn't just walk away. He made his way to the checkout lane, the items in his cart more of a distraction than anything else. The cashier greeted him with a polite smile, but it was hollow to Michael. The normality of it all, this benign interaction, only highlighted the absurdity of the situation. He had just been slapped in the parking lot for no reason other than his skin color, and here he was checking out like nothing had happened. Michael forced a smile and paid, his thoughts racing the entire time. He grabbed his bags quickly, walking toward the exit with a sense of unease gnawing at him. The parking lot was only a few steps away, but the closer he got to his car, the tighter the knot in his stomach became. And then, he saw it. His car, the one he had just parked in that spot moments ago, was damaged. The deep scratches on the side of it were unmistakable, fresh and deliberate. Someone had keyed his car, carving deep, jagged lines into the paint. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the damage, disbelief flooding his mind. It was her. There was no question. Karen had done this while he was inside the store, and now, as he stood there, he could almost hear her laughter in his head, the satisfaction she must have felt knowing that she had gotten away with it. Michael's body tensed, the anger building in his chest once again. He ran a hand over the scratches, his fingers trembling with the realization of just how far she had gone. The slap was bad enough, but this was personal. This was a violation. His mind raced through the options. He could call the police, but he knew how that might go. A black man calling the police over a woman's actions, he'd been down that road before. It always felt like the world was tilted in favor of people like Karen, and he had no reason to believe this situation would be any different. Still, he couldn't just let it slide. He wasn't going to let her get away with it. He looked around the parking lot, half expecting to see her standing nearby, watching him, waiting to see what he would do. But there was no sign of her. She had disappeared, probably back in her SUV, smug and satisfied with herself. For a few moments, Michael stood frozen, staring at the damage. The world seemed to blur around him as he wrestled with the anger, the frustration, and the helplessness that had come crashing down on him all at once. But then something snapped inside him. He couldn't let this go. He needed to confront her. He needed to make sure she knew there would be consequences for her actions. He climbed into his car, his hands still shaking, and started the engine. He wasn't going to let this be the end. As he pulled out of the parking lot, his eyes scanned the road for her SUV, and there it was, a few cars ahead. His heart raced, the determination in his chest building as he followed her down the quiet suburban streets. Michael kept a safe distance between them, not wanting to escalate things further. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done yet. She had pushed him once, slapped him in public, and now she had damaged his car. She had to know there would be a price to pay. As they drove, Michael's mind raced. He had no idea how this would end. Would the police take his side? Would they listen to him? Or would Karen, as she always had, twist the narrative to fit her version of events? He had already heard the words she'd screamed at him in the parking lot, accusing him of being the aggressor, of being nothing more than a thug who didn't belong in her neighborhood. What would happen when the police arrived? His thoughts were interrupted when he saw the flashing red and blue lights up ahead. A sigh of relief escaped him, though it was tinged with the bitter realization that he had been forced into this situation in the first place. Karen's SUV had been pulled over, and the police were already speaking with her. Michael's heart sank. He wasn't alone in this anymore. He had made the right choice. He was going to see this through. As Michael pulled his car to a stop behind the police cruiser, his heart raced in his chest. He hadn't expected the police to be the ones to intervene, but now that they were here, he knew it was time to make sure that the truth came out. He took a deep breath and wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans, preparing himself for the confrontation that was about to unfold. Karen's SUV was stopped in the middle of the street, her doors wide open. Two officers, a man and a woman, stood beside the vehicle, speaking with Karen, who was gesturing wildly, her face flushed with anger. She was pointing in Michael's direction, her shrill voice rising above the calmness of the officers. Michael couldn't hear exactly what she was saying, but he could imagine accusations, insults, all the usual ways she would attempt to paint herself as the victim. He clenched his fists, the fury in his chest building once again. He had already lived through so many similar situations, moments where someone like Karen assumed the power to tear him down simply because of the color of his skin. It wasn't just the slap anymore. It was everything that came with it. The attitude, the sense of entitlement. He stepped out of his car, the pavement cool beneath his feet, and slowly approached the officers. He wanted to make sure they knew his side of the story before they were swayed by Karen's lies. As he got closer, one of the officers, a tall man with dark hair, looked up and saw him approaching. "Sir," the officer said, his tone calm but firm, "can you step over here?" Michael nodded, walking toward the officers, trying to keep his voice steady. As he reached them, Karen's voice cut through the air again, louder this time, her accusations directed at him. "He hit me. He assaulted me. He's the one who's dangerous. He followed me all the way here, and now he's threatening me. You have to arrest him," Karen screeched, her hands flailing in the air. Michael didn't flinch. He had been down this road before, the all-too-familiar narrative of a black man being painted as the aggressor. He'd heard it, seen it, and it always twisted his gut. He wasn't going to let that happen today. "I'm the one who was assaulted," Michael said, his voice low but steady. "I was minding my own business in a parking lot, trying to park in a spot. She confronted me, started yelling at me over something as trivial as a parking space, then shoved me. When I tried to walk away, she slapped me. It wasn't just a slap, though. It was a statement. She thought she could do whatever she wanted. I didn't start this, but I had to defend myself." The officer turned to Karen, who was glaring at him with wild eyes. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "we'll need to take a look at the damage to the vehicle, and we'll need your full account of what happened as well." Karen's eyes widened, and she immediately launched into her own defense. "I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't touch him. He's lying. He started it," she cried, her voice rising with each word. Michael closed his eyes for a second, fighting the rising frustration in his chest. He wasn't surprised by her response. People like Karen always denied their own wrongdoing. They always twisted the truth to suit their narrative. But this time, it wasn't just her word against his. This time, there was evidence. The officer walked over to Michael's car, inspecting the scratches that marred the side of the vehicle. "These look fresh," he noted. "And the rear end of your car was damaged too?" Michael nodded. "Yes. I left the store for maybe 10 minutes, and when I came back out, I found that damage. It wasn't there when I parked. She did this." Karen scoffed from her position near the officers. "You're accusing me of that? That's ridiculous," she shouted. But her voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. The anger she had shown at first seemed to falter in the face of the officer's calm, collected demeanor. The officer continued to survey the damage, then walked back over to Michael. "We'll look at the footage from the store's cameras and check for any further details. But based on the damage here and the testimony, it's clear there was some escalation. You're not the one who started this." Michael breathed a sigh of relief, the knot in his stomach loosening just a little. He had been worried, terrified even, that once again he would be the one blamed, that his calm demeanor would be seen as an invitation for further mistreatment. But this time, things were different. Another officer, a woman with short blonde hair, stepped forward and started asking Karen to step out of her SUV. The woman's tone was polite but firm, clearly accustomed to handling situations like this. "Ma'am, we need you to step out of the vehicle. We're placing you under arrest for assault and property damage. You'll need to come with us." Karen froze, her face turning an ugly shade of crimson as the reality of her situation hit her. "You can't arrest me," she shouted, her voice breaking. "I didn't do anything. He's the one who's dangerous." She backed away, her hands up in front of her defensively, as if she were about to strike again. The officers moved quickly, grabbing her arms and forcing her into the back of the squad car. Her protest continued as they shoved her inside, her wild eyes locking with Michael's one last time. "This isn't over," she spat through the cracked window. "I'll make sure you pay for this. You'll regret ever doing this to me." Michael stood there, watching her thrash against the police officers, still trying to break free from the cuffs. He couldn't believe how far she was willing to go, how determined she was to make herself out to be the victim. But this time, the officers weren't buying it. They weren't letting her manipulate the situation. The truth was clear, and Karen was finally facing the consequences of her actions. As the officers completed their paperwork and prepared to take Karen into custody, Michael felt a strange sense of closure. This wasn't just about winning an argument or standing up for himself. This was about justice, about making sure people like Karen couldn't get away with hurting others, about proving that no matter how much they screamed, no matter how much they lied, their hate would not win. The officers approached Michael, one of them handing him a card with contact information for filing a formal complaint if he wished. "You did the right thing, sir," Officer Reynolds said, his voice sincere. "This will be filed, and we'll keep you updated as it moves forward." Michael nodded, still processing what had happened. He hadn't expected things to escalate this far, but now that they had, he knew he couldn't back down. The ordeal wasn't over yet. There would be a trial, a court case, and who knew how Karen would twist the narrative then. But for now, Michael had a small victory, a moment where the truth had been heard. The days after Karen's arrest felt like an endless cycle of waiting. Michael had given his statement to the police, and the evidence was clear. Her violent outburst in the parking lot, the damage to his car, the slap that had been delivered with all the malicious intent of a woman who thought she could do whatever she pleased. The video footage from the store's cameras had also confirmed what he already knew. Karen had instigated the confrontation, shoving him first, escalating to violence, and then damaging his property. But that didn't change the feeling in his gut. It didn't make him feel less uneasy as he sat in the courtroom, the day of the trial finally upon him. As much as the police had done their job, as much as the evidence spoke for itself, he knew how things often went. He knew the drill, the way the system sometimes twisted itself to favor the aggressor, the way his identity would be scrutinized and questioned far more than hers. Michael arrived early at the courthouse, needing some time to gather his thoughts. The heavy air in the lobby seemed to press down on him, the walls lined with portraits of those who had fought for justice, their expressions stern and unyielding. As he walked through the halls, he could feel eyes on him. A few people, standing around in the waiting area, whispered and shot furtive glances his way. He didn't know if they were judging him or simply curious about the case. Either way, it felt suffocating. The doors to the courtroom finally opened, and Michael entered. The room was filled with a quiet tension, people seated in rows of benches, the judge's bench elevated above it all, watching over the proceedings. He took a seat, his fingers lightly tapping the wooden armrest, a mix of dread and anticipation settling into his chest. The judge, a tall woman in her mid-50s with sharp eyes, entered the room. "All rise," she called, her voice commanding the attention of everyone present. The room stood, and Michael felt his pulse quicken in the stillness of the moment. Judge Patricia Simmons, known for her no-nonsense demeanor, took her seat, and the room fell into an expectant silence. She wasted no time in calling the case, and the trial began. Michael's eyes scanned the room, taking in the prosecution team, the defense attorney, and of course Karen, who sat at the defense table. Her eyes locked straight ahead, her expression unreadable but tense. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Ms. Hayes, stood and addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have here today is a clear case of assault and property damage. Mr. Michael Jennings, the victim in this case, was simply trying to park his car in a spot when the defendant, Karen Thompson, approached him with hostility. She verbally attacked him, shoved him, and when he tried to walk away, she slapped him across the face. Not only did she assault Mr. Jennings, but she also damaged his vehicle, causing extensive scratches and dents. And to make matters worse, when he tried to leave the scene, she escalated the situation further by intentionally ramming his car with her own." M. Hayes turned toward the jury, her tone steady and filled with authority. "This isn't just an argument about parking. This is about accountability. This is about a woman who thought she could bully a man and destroy his property because of the color of his skin. This is about someone who believed that her entitled, racist views would give her a free pass to do whatever she wanted. We are here today because that cannot stand. We are here to make sure that she is held responsible for her actions." Karen's lawyer, a gray-haired man with a soft voice and the air of someone who had spent years making excuses for people like her, stood up for the defense's opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice calm, soothing, as though trying to ease the tension in the room. This has been blown out of proportion. Yes, my client, Ms. Thompson, was upset. Yes, she acted out of frustration. She made a mistake. But let's not forget the context here. She's a mother, a hardworking woman in this community who was having a bad day. Mr. Jennings, on the other hand, responded with violence. When she slapped him, he slapped her right back. Is that what we're really here to discuss? Is this really a case of assault and damage? Or is it about a simple misunderstanding that got out of hand? Michael felt his blood boil at the audacity of Karen's lawyer. There was no understanding of the racial dynamics at play, no acknowledgement of the clear escalation that had started with Karen's push, her insults, and her racial slurs. She hadn't been frustrated. She had been filled with hatred, fueled by the belief that she had a right to intimidate him, to shove him and slap him without consequence. But there was no room for that in this courtroom. Not today. Karen's lawyer continued, "We are asking for your compassion, to look beyond this isolated incident and see the bigger picture. My client is not a criminal. She is a person, and what happened that day was simply an unfortunate series of events." Michael couldn't contain his frustration. The courtroom had been silent until now, but his fingers clenched tightly into fists, his nail biting into his palms. He wanted to stand up and shout, to tell the jury the truth, to make them see that this wasn't just some isolated incident. It was part of a systemic issue, a way of life for many people like Karen, who thought they could get away with hurting people like him. But instead, he held his tongue. It wasn't his job to convince them. That was for the prosecution. The trial continued with witness testimonies. A few bystanders who had been in the parking lot when the incident occurred took the stand. They described how Karen had aggressively confronted Michael, how her insults had escalated into violence, and how Michael had reacted in self-defense. One witness, a middle-aged man named Jeffrey Caldwell, spoke clearly. "I was there," Jeffrey said, addressing the jury. "I saw the whole thing. She was yelling at him, cursing at him. He didn't raise his voice, didn't get physical until she shoved him, and then she slapped him across the face. When she slapped him, he didn't hit her back out of anger or malice. He slapped her back because she hit him first. It wasn't a blow meant to hurt her. It was just a response to stop her from hitting him again." Michael couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief as the witness's testimony supported his version of events. But deep down, he knew this wouldn't be enough. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. There was still Karen, still her lawyer, still the racial prejudices that lingered in the minds of some jurors. Then came Karen's turn on the stand. She had taken the seat with an air of arrogance, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in front of her. As her lawyer began questioning her, she presented herself as the picture of innocence. Her words were filled with remorse, but it was clear to Michael and the jury that she wasn't truly sorry for what she had done. She was sorry that things had gotten out of control, sorry that she was caught. "I was just having a terrible day," Karen explained, her voice soft. "I was already upset when I saw Mr. Jennings park in the spot I was waiting for. I lost it. But when I slapped him, it was a reflex. He slapped me right back, and I didn't deserve that. I wasn't the one who escalated things. He attacked me first." Michael's anger flared as he listened to her, but he stayed silent. The absurdity of her claims, of her turning the story on its head, was mind-boggling. But what made it worse was how many people would have believed her. How many would listen to her story and ignore his. She wasn't just playing the victim. She was trying to rewrite history. The cross-examination by the prosecution was swift. M. Hayes, the prosecutor, asked her the hard questions, pulling at the inconsistencies in her story. "You admit that you slapped Mr. Jennings first, correct?" Emsa Hayes asked, her voice controlled. Karen hesitated for a moment, but eventually nodded. "Yes, but he slapped me back. He shouldn't have done that. He didn't have to respond that way." "Is it possible," Monsieur Hayes continued, "that his slap was a reaction, a defense, and not an attack?" Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly thrown by the question. I suppose it was a reaction." "Then would you agree," Monsieur Hayes pressed, "that Mr. Jennings did not initiate the violence but only responded to being assaulted first?" Karen remained silent, her eyes darting toward her lawyer, but the damage had been done. The truth was out, and there was no way for her to twist it back. The days following the testimony were tense. The court had recessed for the weekend, but Michael could barely find rest. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind replayed the events of that day in the parking lot. The slap, the push, the indignation that she had shown, and the way she had twisted everything into a narrative that painted him as the aggressor. But Michael knew the truth. The truth had been laid bare in that courtroom. He had not asked for this confrontation, nor had he wanted it. All he had done was park his car and attempt to go about his day, only to be confronted with the worst of racism. And when Karen had escalated, when she had pushed him, shoved him, slapped him, Michael had reacted in self-defense. Nothing more. And yet, he was now fighting for his dignity in front of strangers, in a courtroom, with his every word and action under the microscope. It wasn't just about the slap anymore. It wasn't even about the damage to his car. No, this trial had become something bigger, a symbol of a battle he was tired of fighting. Every time he stood up for himself, every time he fought back against the microaggressions and overt racism, he was made to feel like the outsider, the one at fault. It was exhausting. His shoulders felt heavier with each passing day. When Monday morning finally arrived, he walked into the courthouse with a sense of grim determination. This wasn't just about him. This was about justice, about standing up to the kind of racism that had stained his life and so many others. And today, in the final moments of this trial, he knew that it was time to bring this battle to its peak. The courtroom was filled with murmurs as people settled in for what they all knew would be the closing arguments. Michael stood, his back straight, his mind sharp. He wasn't about to let Karen's lies and the defense's manipulations take away what he knew was right. The defense team was first to present their closing argument. Karen's lawyer, the soft-spoken man who had tried so hard to frame her as the victim, stood up and walked to the front. He looked directly at the jury, his eyes calculating as if he could sway them with the right words. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let's not forget the bigger picture here," he said, his tone measured and calm, designed to play on emotions. Yes, Miss Thompson made a mistake. She lost her temper. But Mr. Jennings, he retaliated. He slapped her back. And while it's true she caused damage to his car, we must look at her state of mind. She was under stress. She was reacting to what she perceived as an attack. We cannot ignore the human side of this situation. We ask you, in light of the evidence, to consider the possibility that this was just a momentary lapse in judgment, an unfortunate altercation that got out of control. His words hung in the air. The tension was palpable, as though the entire room was holding its breath. Michael's jaw tightened. He knew this was exactly what they would do. Minimize the severity of Karen's actions. Ignore the fact that she had physically assaulted him and damaged his property, and instead try to paint this as a misunderstanding between two people. The defense attorney paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then, with a knowing glance at Karen, he added, "Ms. Thompson is not a criminal. She is a mother. She is a member of this community, and this is simply a mistake she regrets." Michael clenched his fists, but he didn't let his emotions take control. He had to stay calm. The truth was on his side, and he couldn't let it slip away now. As Karen's lawyer returned to his seat, Hayes stood up, her movement confident and purposeful. She didn't need to waste words on manipulating the jury's emotions. Instead, she focused entirely on the facts, on the undeniable truth of what had happened. She walked to the front, meeting the eyes of each juror before addressing them with steady conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we've heard today is a classic case of deflection," Hayes began. "What we've seen is a woman who felt entitled to do whatever she wanted, regardless of the consequences. She shoved Mr. Jennings, insulted him, slapped him across the face, and damaged his property. She acted with aggression. Mr. Jennings didn't start this. He didn't instigate the confrontation. He tried to walk away from the altercation, but she wouldn't let him. She followed him, verbally attacked him, and physically assaulted him. And when he reacted, when he defended himself, she tried to spin the narrative to make herself the victim." Hayes turned slightly to face Karen, her voice firm. "This is not about a simple lapse in judgment. This is about a pattern of behavior. This is about a woman who believed she could treat Mr. Jennings as less than human, who thought she could slap him in front of others and get away with it because of his race. She thought that she could escalate the situation and walk away without consequences. But she was wrong. The words hit hard, like a hammer against the fragile walls Karen had tried to build around herself. Her eyes darted nervously as Emmett Hayes continued. The defendant has been trying to manipulate this case from the beginning. She tried to make herself the victim, tried to erase the truth, to turn the whole situation upside down. But the evidence is clear. The witnesses, the video footage, and Mr. Jennings' testimony, all of it points to one thing. The defendant assaulted Mr. Jennings, and he was simply defending himself. Emmett Hayes' words were direct and unyielding. Mr. Jennings didn't start this fight. He didn't ask for it. But when pushed, when assaulted, he stood his ground. He didn't escalate the violence. He simply reacted to being attacked. And that is why we ask for justice, not just for Mr. Jennings, but for the larger truth, that no one, no matter their race, should be treated the way Karen Thompson treated him. No one should be slapped, insulted, or attacked because of the color of their skin. No one should be made to feel inferior, not in this courtroom, not in this country, and not in this world. Michael could feel the weight of those words settle over him. It wasn't just his personal battle anymore. This was bigger. This was for everyone who had ever been treated unjustly, who had ever been belittled because of the color of their skin. This was about showing that racism wouldn't be allowed to win, no matter how many people like Karen tried to perpetuate it. As Mr. Hayes finished her statement, the courtroom remained quiet. The jury was deep in thought, and the air felt thick with anticipation. The judge, after a brief pause, spoke. "The jury will now deliberate. You may return to the jury room." The courtroom erupted into soft murmurs as the jurors filed out, taking their deliberations behind closed doors. Michael sat still, his hands resting on his lap, his thoughts swirling. It was over for now, but the outcome was uncertain. As he left the courthouse and walked out into the cool afternoon air, he couldn't help but wonder, would justice prevail? Would the jury see past Karen's lies and recognize the truth? Or would they find a way to let her off the hook? To let her continue believing that her racism was something she could just brush aside? He didn't know, but he knew one thing for sure. He had done the right thing. He had stood up for himself. He had fought for what was right, and no one could take that away from him. But that wasn't the end of it. The fight for justice, for equality, was ongoing, and Michael was determined to keep fighting, no matter the outcome of this trial. The days following the final arguments were a blur of anticipation, tension, and unresolved anxiety. Michael had gone home after the trial and sat in his small apartment, the weight of the case pressing heavily on his chest. He tried to keep his mind focused on anything other than the courtroom. But every time he closed his eyes, the events of that day, the slap, the words, the accusations, would flood back into his mind. It wasn't just the fear of the verdict that plagued him. It was the realization that no matter the outcome of this case, Karen's actions, her sense of entitlement, and her belief that she could get away with it just because of the color of his skin would linger. People like her existed in every corner of the world, and the thought that they could carry on, unchecked and unrepentant, gnawed at him. His phone buzzed beside him on the couch. It was a message from his lawyer, informing him that the jury would return with their verdict the following day. The message was concise, but the implications were clear. After weeks of testimony, deliberations, and emotional turmoil, the moment of truth had finally arrived. The next morning, Michael stood outside the courthouse, his body tense, his heart racing. The weight of the day ahead pressed down on him like an unseen force, and his thoughts bounced between hope and fear. His breath was shallow, his hands cold from the anxiety swirling inside him. He entered the courthouse and took his seat in the courtroom, his eyes scanning the room. The atmosphere was thick with unease. There were no witnesses today, no lawyers standing tall in their arguments, just a room full of people waiting for what came next. Karen, sitting at the defense table, was silent. She held her head high as though nothing had changed, as though she was still in control, even after everything. Finally, the door opened. The jury filed in. Michael's breath caught in his throat as the four-person jury took their seats. His lawyer, sitting beside him, gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder, but it didn't calm the storm inside. This was it. The jury had reached their conclusion. They had deliberated, discussed, and now they were going to decide his fate. The foreperson of the jury stood, the silence in the room palpable. "We, the jury," she began, her voice clear and deliberate, "find the defendant, Karen Thompson, guilty of assault and property damage." The words hit Michael like a wave crashing into the shore. For a split second, time seemed to slow down. He exhaled slowly, his body sagging with the release of breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Guilty. It was done. Justice had been served. And yet, Michael couldn't fully believe it. His mind kept replaying Karen's face as she had stormed through the parking lot, her words laced with venom, her sense of superiority. He thought about all the times in his life when he'd been denied justice simply because of the color of his skin. The judge raised her gavel and declared, "This court is adjourned. Sentencing will take place next week." Michael stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. He turned to his lawyer, trying to put on a brave face, but all he could feel was the weight of the past few weeks. The emotional toll, the physical confrontation, the constant fear of being wrongly accused. It wasn't just about the trial anymore. It was about everything that had led him to this moment. As he walked out of the courtroom, he was surrounded by reporters, their cameras flashing, microphones thrust into his face. He had seen this before, but this time it was different. This time he had won. The thought of having to relive the moments in front of the cameras was overwhelming. But he knew it was part of the process, part of the cost of standing up for what was right. The questions came fast and furious, but Michael was too drained to care. He answered the questions in a monotone, his words coming out stiff and controlled. "Justice has been served," he said, his voice steady but hollow. "This trial wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who has ever been treated unfairly, who has ever been oppressed because of their race." He couldn't help but feel that the words, though true, were too simple. They didn't capture the complexities of the emotional toll this had taken on him. They didn't capture the fight it had taken just to stay calm, to keep from losing control. The fight to keep his dignity intact while Karen had done everything in her power to strip it away. When he finally reached his car, he sat behind the wheel for a long moment, the engine still off. The reality of the situation began to set in. The trial was over. Karen was guilty. But Michael knew this wasn't the end. This wasn't the final chapter in this story. The consequences of what had happened, what Karen had done, would ripple through his life, through the community, and beyond. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about what her actions represented. Racism was still alive. It still existed in places, both subtle and overt. The verdict wasn't going to change that. But for the first time in a long while, Michael allowed himself a small smile. Today, he had stood his ground. Today, he had won. And that, at least, was something. As Michael sat there staring out the windshield, he realized that this fight, this never-ending battle for equality and justice, was far from over. But it was a fight he would continue to face head-on, with every ounce of strength he had, because the truth was, this wasn't just about one woman. This was about a system that had allowed people like Karen to act with impunity. It was about standing up to that system and making it clear that there were consequences for racist actions. This was just one victory in a long war, but it was a victory nonetheless. The days following the verdict were quiet, yet the weight of what had transpired hung heavily in the air. Michael felt like a prisoner of his own thoughts, trapped in a perpetual cycle of frustration and anger. The trial was over, and the court had spoken, but the realization was slowly sinking in. This was just one battle in an ongoing war against racism, one that would continue long after the verdict had been handed down. The decision had been a small victory, but Michael knew it was just a drop in the ocean of injustice that he faced every day. As he walked down the street, he could feel the eyes of strangers on him, the whispers, the subtle shifts in behavior when people realized who he was, the man who had stood up in court against the racism of Karen Thompson. Despite the fact that Karen had been found guilty, the underlying problem still existed. Racism didn't go away with a guilty verdict or a fine. It didn't vanish because someone had been held accountable. It seeped into the fabric of daily life, manifesting itself in subtle, insidious ways, like the way people avoided eye contact, crossed the street when he walked by, or made assumptions about his background simply because of his skin color. Michael couldn't escape the feeling that the world was watching him, not as a man who had fought for justice, but as a symbol, a representation of a broken system. Everyone expected him to have all the answers, to single-handedly end the cycle of hatred and bigotry that plagues society. But that wasn't how it worked. Change was slow, and more often than not, it felt impossible. It wasn't just the public that weighed on him. It was the toll it had taken on his personal life. His relationships, once simple and free of tension, had grown strained. Friends who once supported him now seemed distant, uncertain of how to approach the topic of race and the very real injustice he had faced. His family had been no different. They were proud of him, of course, but they too had no real answers for the kind of world he was living in. And it wasn't just the personal battles that consumed him. The pressure was mounting from all sides. The media, who had once flooded the courtroom to document every moment of the trial, were now eager to follow up, to get his opinion on the broader implications of the case. Every interview, every article, felt like a reminder that racism wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Michael found himself retreating further into himself. He would spend hours alone in his apartment, reading articles, watching news reports, scrolling through social media, searching for some sign that things were changing. The fight felt endless, and the weight of it all was wearing him down. One evening, as he sat in his apartment, staring blankly at the television, his phone buzzed. It was an unexpected message from his lawyer. "Michael, I know this is a lot to process, but I have something you need to hear. There's been a huge uptick in support for your case. I've had several people from across the country reach out. Civil rights activists, legal experts, even a few political figures. They want to meet with you." Michael stared at the message, his fingers hovering over the screen. Was this a breakthrough? Was it a sign that people were finally paying attention to the fight against racial injustice? Or was it just another fleeting moment of hope that would quickly fade away? He quickly typed back a response. "What kind of support are we talking about?" The reply came almost immediately. "People want to take your case beyond just this trial. They want to use your experience to fuel a larger movement, to raise awareness about the everyday racism that still exists in America. They think you could be the catalyst for something much bigger." The idea hit Michael like a lightning bolt. For so long, he had been caught in the whirlwind of his personal battle, focusing on his own pain and frustration. But what if this was bigger than him? What if his story could inspire others, could bring about change on a much larger scale? It was a powerful thought, one that Michael hadn't considered. The idea of becoming a symbol for something more was both empowering and terrifying. He had no idea what would come next, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't ignore the opportunity. He had already stood up for himself. Now it was time to stand up for the countless others who had been silenced by racism, who had suffered in the shadows of this broken system. Over the next few weeks, Michael began to engage in conversations with activists, legal experts, and leaders who were eager to help him turn his fight into something that could inspire real change. They discussed strategies for raising awareness, for mobilizing communities, and for pushing for systemic change in the way that law enforcement, the courts, and society at large dealt with issues of racism and discrimination. But the more he spoke with these passionate individuals, the more he realized just how much work still needed to be done. The fight wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead would be long, and there would be plenty of resistance along the way. But Michael felt a fire inside him that had been burning brighter since the trial. He had been knocked down, humiliated, and dismissed, but he had risen again, and now he was ready to do it for others. As Michael continued to meet with activists, attend rallies, and speak at community events, he realized that the fight for racial justice was far from over. The backlash from people like Karen would continue. The people who refused to see him as an equal would always be there, lurking in the background, waiting for their next opportunity to strike. But Michael had learned something over the past few months. He was not alone. Every time he spoke out, Every time he shared a story, there were others who stood with him. The support grew louder, more organized, more determined, and together they would make their voices heard. The fight wasn't over, but now Michael knew that he didn't have to fight it alone. The weeks that followed the trial were both exhilarating and exhausting for Michael. The message from his lawyer had planted a seed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the idea that he had a chance to do something bigger than just fight for justice for himself. He knew his battle with Karen wasn't isolated. It was part of a much larger, ongoing fight for racial equality in America. As he delved deeper into the conversations with civil rights activists and legal experts, he began to realize the weight of what lay ahead. The rallies, the marches, the speeches, they all took on new meaning now. It wasn't just about him anymore. His personal experience had become a symbol of the injustice that many Black Americans face daily. People were rallying behind him, people who had also experienced the same prejudice, the same discrimination, the same feeling of being treated like an outsider in their own country. It was on a particularly rainy afternoon when Michael received a call that would change everything. The line buzzed with ecstatic as his lawyer's voice came through. "Michael, I have some big news. I've been in talks with a group of national activists. They want to include your case in a national campaign for racial justice. We're talking about a nationwide movement here." Michael felt his pulse quicken. His mind raced with the implications. This could be the moment where his pain, his struggle, became part of something much larger. It could be the spark that ignited a fire of change across the country. The thought of being a part of a movement that could transform the landscape of racial justice was both humbling and intimidating. But Michael had learned to take challenges head on. The road ahead would be filled with obstacles. He knew that. But he had been fighting this battle for so long, and now he had the chance to make a real impact. "Tell me more," he said, his voice steady despite the rush of emotions swirling inside him. His lawyer explained that several organizations were already on board, including some of the most well-known civil rights groups in the country. They had seen Michael's case as a perfect example of the systemic racism that had persisted in American society for centuries. The idea was to highlight the personal stories of individuals like Michael, who had been victims of racial prejudice, and use those stories to push for policy changes, greater accountability for law enforcement, and increased public awareness. For Michael, the decision wasn't an easy one, Fatin. He'd been thrown into the spotlight against his will, but now he was in control. He could either keep fighting for his own dignity and peace of mind, or stand up for the countless others who had suffered like him. His decision was clear. "I'm in," he said firmly. "Let's make this happen." The first rally was held in a park downtown, where hundreds of people gathered under the overcast sky, their faces a mix of determination and hope. It wasn't just about Michael anymore. It was about all the people who had faced the same kind of treatment he had, the same kind of humiliation, the same kind of disregard for their humanity. Michael stood at the front of the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. The speeches from the activists had been powerful, each one urging people to stand together, to fight against the injustice that had been perpetuated for so long. But now it was his turn. The crowd grew silent as he stepped up to the microphone. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, some hopeful, some skeptical, but all listening. He took a deep breath, knowing that this was his moment. This was the opportunity he had been given to tell his story and make sure it wouldn't just be another tale of victimhood. It would be a call to action. "I stand here today, not as a man who has simply been wronged by one person," Michael began, his voice steady and clear. "I stand here as a man who has been wronged by a system that has allowed people to dehumanize others based on the color of their skin, a system that has protected the perpetrators and silenced the victims." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces in front of him. Their eyes were filled with hope, and their hearts were full of resolve. "I am not the only one. Every day, across this country, Black people are subjected to the same kind of treatment. We are marginalized, we are overlooked, we are criminalized for no reason other than the color of our skin. But today we stand together to say no more. We will not let this injustice stand. We will not allow ourselves to be silenced." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers filling the air, with energy and unity. Michael felt a surge of pride, of connection to the people around him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever faced the same discrimination. And in that moment, he knew that this wasn't just about one case. It was about changing the system, about standing up against a history of racial inequality that had persisted for far too long. The rally didn't end there. Over the next few weeks, Michael and the group of activists worked tirelessly to spread the message of justice, holding rallies in cities across the country. They faced resistance, of course. There were always those who didn't want change, those who were comfortable in their privilege and power. But they pushed on, knowing that they were on the right side of history. One of the most powerful moments came when Michael was invited to speak at a national conference on racial justice. The event brought together leaders from across the political spectrum, as well as activists, legal professionals, and victims of racial discrimination. Michael knew that this was the largest audience he'd ever had, and the pressure was immense. But he was ready. As he took the stage, the weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he was no longer the scared, angry man who had been slapped by Karen in that parking lot. He had grown, he had learned, he had become a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for those who had been left behind. "Today I stand before you not just as Michael Jennings," he began, his voice carrying across the room. "I stand as every person who has ever been dehumanized, discriminated against, and silenced because of the color of their skin. I stand as a testament to the fact that racism is alive and well in this country, and I stand here today to tell you that we are done being silent." The crowd was rapt, hanging on every word. "We are not asking for your sympathy. We are asking for your action. We are demanding that this system be changed, that those who perpetuate this violence and hate be held accountable. And we will not stop until that happens." Michael's life had changed dramatically in the weeks that followed the national conference. His speeches and the rallies had ignited a fire of passion and hope among people who were just as tired of the systemic racism that had plagued their communities for years. He had become a symbol of change, not just for Black people, but for everyone who had ever felt oppressed. However, the road ahead was not without its challenges. The national movement, dubbed Justice for All, had garnered widespread attention. People were organizing protests in cities from coast to coast, demanding an end to racial injustice and inequality. The media coverage was intense, and politicians could no longer ignore the growing tide of public outrage. But as the movement gained momentum, so too did the pushback from those who were determined to maintain the status quo. Michael had been thrust into the role of an activist and a leader in a way he had never anticipated. He had been a man simply fighting for his dignity, but now he was leading a revolution. There were moments when he questioned whether he was the right person for the job. After all, he was still a man who had been slapped in a parking lot and humiliated in front of strangers. But his fight was no longer just about him. It was about the millions of people who had been treated unfairly, the people who felt invisible and unheard. It was about giving them a voice. One evening, as Michael sat in his apartment, reviewing the plans for an upcoming rally in New York City, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his lawyer. "Michael, we've received word that the city is preparing for a major crackdown on protesters. They are planning to use aggressive tactics, including arresting leaders. You need to be careful." Michael read the message twice, his stomach sinking. He had known that the opposition was going to escalate things, but he had hoped it wouldn't come to this. He had seen enough videos of peaceful protesters being brutalized by police officers, and now he was facing the reality that he might be next. He texted back, "What's the next step?" The response came quickly. "Stay visible, stay vocal. The more eyes we have on you, the harder it will be for them to attack you without consequence. We'll be monitoring everything closely." The rally in New York City was set to be the largest yet. Thousands of people were expected to march through the streets, demanding justice, equality, and an end to police brutality. Michael had been invited to speak at the front of the march, standing side by side with civil rights leaders, community organizers, and activists who had dedicated their lives to fighting for racial justice. The day of the rally, Michael woke up early, his heart pounding with both excitement and fear. This rally wasn't just another protest, it was the turning point. It was the day that the movement would either gain the support of the public or face severe opposition from the powers that be. As he stood in front of the crowd, looking out over the sea of faces, black and white, young and old, he felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest. This was bigger than him. This was a moment in history. The march began with a roar of energy, people chanting slogans and holding signs demanding justice. The streets were filled with people of all races, united by a single cause. Michael led the way, his voice carrying over the crowd, calling for peace, unity, and justice. It felt like the entire city was alive with the power of change. But as they moved closer to the center of the city, the mood shifted. The air grew tense. People began to notice the police presence, heavily armed officers lining the streets, blocking off intersections, and scanning the crowd with cold, watchful eyes. Michael's heart raced. He knew what this meant. The authorities were preparing for something bigger. The first sign of trouble came when a group of protesters tried to march past a line of officers. The officers moved in quickly, pushing the protesters back with force. The crowd began to swell with frustration. People shouted at the officers, demanding that they let them pass, but the officers stood their ground, pushing harder. Michael stepped forward, raising his hands to calm the crowd. "We're here for justice, not for violence," he shouted over the roar. "We will not let them turn us into the enemy. We are here for change, not to fight." But the tension had already reached its breaking point. A few protesters, unable to take the abuse any longer, began to shout at the police. A scuffle broke out. The officers responded with force, using batons and shields to push back the crowd. Michael's chest tightened as he watched the scene unfold. This wasn't supposed to be like this. He had envisioned a peaceful march, a demonstration of unity. But now it seemed like all the anger and frustration of the past was coming to a head. The fight for justice was no longer just about words. It was about survival. In the chaos that followed, Michael found himself face to face with an officer who seemed determined to escalate the situation. The officer shoved him back with a force that sent him stumbling. Without thinking, Michael shoved the officer back. It wasn't aggressive, it was a reflex, a way to protect himself. But it was enough to set off a chain of events. The officer reacted instantly, grabbing Michael's arm and twisting it behind his back. "You're under arrest," the officer barked, his voice cold and menacing, "for inciting a riot." Michael's mind raced. This wasn't what he had planned. This wasn't what he had fought for. But as the officer handcuffed him and shoved him into the back of a police car, Michael realized something profound. This moment, this arrest, wasn't just about him. It was about everything he had stood for. It was a moment of transformation. It was a moment that would send a clear message to the world. People of color would no longer be silenced. The arrest made headlines across the country. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the spark that ignited the conversation about police brutality and the racial divide in America. The media portrayed the events in different ways, some focusing on the violence that had erupted in the streets, others highlighting the fact that Michael, the leader of the movement, had been arrested. But for Michael, the experience was a turning point. The anger he had felt toward the system, the disbelief, the exhaustion, all of it boiled over in that moment. He was no longer just a man trying to fight for justice. He had become a symbol of resistance. And he wasn't about to back down now. The days following Michael's arrest were a blur. The media coverage was relentless, and every outlet seemed to have a different perspective on the events that had unfolded in the streets of New York City. Some labeled him a hero, others branded him as a troublemaker. But one thing was clear. Michael Jennings had become the face of the movement for racial justice. The public was divided. Protests erupted in cities across the country, with people voicing their support for Michael and demanding his release. At the same time, the government and law enforcement stood firm, determined to make an example of him. His trial was set to take place in a few weeks, and the pressure on both sides was palpable. Michael sat in his cell, the cold metal bars separating him from the outside world. Despite the enormity of the situation, a sense of calm had settled over him. He knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. The trial wasn't just about his actions, it was about the systemic racism that had been allowed to fester unchecked for so long. His arrest was a symbol, and whether he won or lost, the message would be heard. The day of the trial arrived, and Michael walked into the courtroom, his head held high. He was surrounded by his legal team, but it was clear that all eyes were on him. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and every movement was scrutinized. On one side of the room, Karen Thompson, the woman who had called the police on Michael during the rally, sat at the defendant's table. Her demeanor was calm, almost detached, but Michael could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. She was no longer just a woman with an entitled attitude. She was the personification of the forces that sought to maintain the oppressive systems Michael had spent his entire life fighting against. As Michael took his seat, the prosecution team stood and began their opening statements. They painted a picture of a peaceful protest that had been disrupted by Michael's supposed incitement to violence. They described how Michael had allegedly encouraged the crowd to confront the police, resulting in the chaos that followed. The prosecutor's words were measured, but they carried a venomous undertone that made Michael's blood boil. He knew what was coming. They would try to paint him as the aggressor, as the man who had caused the unrest. But when it was his turn, Michael's defense attorney stood up and addressed the court with a firm, confident voice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this trial is not about Michael Jennings. It is not about one man or one protest. This trial is about a system that has repeatedly failed to treat every person with the dignity and respect they deserve, simply because of the color of their skin." Her words echoed through the courtroom, cutting through the tension like a blade. Michael sat tall, the weight of her statement filling him with a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever been silenced, oppressed, and denied their rights because of their race. This was the fight of a generation. The trial proceeded, and the prosecution called several witnesses, each one testifying that Michael had escalated the situation and led the crowd into violence. Karen Thompson was called to the stand, and as she took her seat, Michael's heart clenched. She was about to twist the truth once again. She was about to paint herself as the victim. The defense was prepared. Michael's lawyer asked Karen pointed questions, challenging her version of events. "You claim that Mr. Jennings incited the violence," she said, "but isn't it true that you were the one who started the confrontation with him over a parking spot? Isn't it true that you physically shoved him before anything happened?" Karen hesitated, but then responded, I didn't mean for it to escalate like that. But he hit me first. He slapped me. He was violent." The defense lawyer turned to the jury, making her point clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, the reality is that Mr. Jennings only defended himself after being physically attacked. He did not instigate violence. He responded to it. And yet, somehow he is the one on trial here today." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt as though the courtroom collectively held its breath. Michael could see the doubt starting to creep into the jury's eyes. He knew they were starting to question Karen's narrative, but there was more to come. The defense called a key witness, Jeffrey Caldwell, the bystander who had witnessed the entire altercation in the parking lot. Jeffrey was calm as he described what had happened, his account aligning with Michael's version of the events. "I saw it all," he said. "Miss Thompson was the one who started yelling at Mr. Jennings. She shoved him, and then she slapped him. Michael didn't even hit her back with force. He just reacted. It wasn't an attack, it was self-defense." The jury listened intently, and for the first time, Michael felt the tide shifting in his favor. The truth was coming out. As the trial entered its final stages, the tension in the courtroom grew. Both sides had made their cases, and now it was up to the jury to decide Michael's fate. Outside the courtroom, the streets were alive with anticipation. People were holding their breath, waiting for the verdict that would determine not just Michael's future, but the future of the movement he had come to represent. The courtroom was packed for the final closing statements. Michael's defense attorney stood and addressed the jury with an impassioned plea. "This case is not just about Michael Jennings," she said. "This case is about justice. It's about holding people accountable, not just for their actions, but for the systems they represent. Michael has fought his entire life to be treated equally, to be seen as a man, not a stereotype. He didn't start this fight, but he's going to finish it. And with your help, we can show the world that justice is possible, even in the face of overwhelming injustice. Her words hung in the air, a powerful call to action. The jury deliberated for hours, and Michael sat in his seat, his mind racing. What would the verdict be? Would they see through Karen's lies, or would the system fail him again? Finally, the jury returned to the courtroom. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as the foreperson stood and began to speak. We, the jury, find the defendant, Karen Thompson, guilty of assault and property damage. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The weight of the words hit Michael like a ton of bricks. It was over. Justice had been served. Karen's face drained of color as the reality of the verdict set in. She had been found guilty, and she would face the consequences of her actions. Michael exhaled slowly, his heart lightening with relief. As he left the courthouse, surrounded by supporters and the media, Michael knew that this victory was just the beginning. The fight was far from over, but today, for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were winning. The air outside the courthouse felt different now. It was as if the world had shifted on its axis, just enough to make everything feel slightly out of place. Michael Jennings walked with slow, deliberate steps, his heart still racing from the adrenaline of the trial. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement, and yet it felt like a new day was dawning. For a moment, the weight of the past few weeks lifted, and he could finally breathe a little easier. But as the crowd surrounded him, calling out their support, cheering his victory, a new thought crept into his mind. The celebration was important, but it was also fleeting. He knew better than to think that one trial, one verdict, would end the cycle of systemic injustice that had brought him here in the first place. The streets were alive with voices, people who had gathered to celebrate this victory. They were chanting his name, raising their fists in solidarity, but Michael wasn't sure if he could feel the full weight of it. His thoughts kept returning to the trial, the way Karen had twisted the truth, how she had manipulated the system to try and portray herself as the victim. How many times had this happened before? How many times had people like her managed to escape consequences for their actions? He wasn't sure if this was a victory or just a brief, fleeting acknowledgement of a larger battle. As the crowd outside the courthouse continued to cheer, Michael's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from his lawyer. "Meet me at the office when you can. We need to discuss next steps." Michael nodded to himself. The victory was important, but it wasn't the end. There were still steps to take, and he knew that his fight for justice didn't stop with the courtroom verdict. It was about what came next, the ripple effect of this moment, and how he could continue to challenge the system that had failed so many others before him. Inside his lawyer's office, Michael sat in a chair, his hands folded on the table. His lawyer, Lisa Turner, leaned against the desk across from him, her face serious. The victory of the trial had brought a sense of relief, but now that the dust was settling, the real work began. "So, what now?" Michael asked, his voice low but filled with the weight of everything that had happened. Lisa sighed. "You've done something incredible here, but there's more to this. The verdict is a win, yes, but it's just one part of a much larger movement. The media is already calling you a hero, but you know how this works. There's backlash coming. People like Karen Thompson will try to make this about something it's not. She'll try to claim that she was the victim all along and that the system was biased against her. The press will eat it up. You need to be ready." Michael sat back in his chair. "I don't care what they say. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to be the face of this movement." "I know," Lisa said gently, "but you are now, and that means you have a platform. You have the chance to change things, to use your experience to show people how deep the injustice really runs. But it's going to take time, effort, and a whole lot of work." Michael looked out the window, watching the people pass by on the street below. The weight of it all suddenly felt heavier than ever before. He had always known that racism was real, that people like Karen existed, but now he could see it more clearly than ever before. The hatred, the entitlement, the way she had looked at him as though he was less than human. That wasn't something that could be easily erased. It was a cultural mindset, deeply ingrained in a system designed to keep certain people in power and others oppressed. "It's exhausting," Michael admitted. "The constant fight. I'm just so tired of it." Lisa gave him a soft smile. I know, but you're not alone in this. There are millions of people who are with you. This is bigger than just you. This is about all of us, everyone who has ever been marginalized. We have a chance to make real change, but it's going to take all of us. Michael nodded slowly, realizing that Lisa was right. He had a responsibility now, not just to himself, but to everyone who had ever been in his position, to those who had suffered in silence. This wasn't just a battle about one person. It was a fight for justice, for equality, for dignity, and it would take more than a courtroom victory to win it. Later that evening, as Michael returned home, his phone buzzed once more. This time it was a call. He answered without hesitation. Michael? The voice on the other end was familiar. It was his older brother, Marcus. I saw the verdict. I'm proud of you, man. But I know it's not over. You're going to have to be ready for the fallout. Michael let out a long breath. Yeah, I know. I didn't expect everything to change overnight. You've got a lot of people backing you now, but it's going to get hard, Marcus continued. You're going to face opposition, people trying to tear you down. Don't let them. I won't, Michael replied, determination in his voice. This isn't just about me. It's about what's right. We can't keep letting things slide, letting people like Karen get away with this. There was a pause on the line, and then Marcus spoke again, his voice softer. I know you're strong, Mike. You've always been. But don't forget to take care of yourself, too. This fight isn't just physical. It's mental. It'll wear you down. I hear you, Michael said. But right now, I'm more focused than ever. I'm going to keep pushing. We have to. Marcus chuckled. That's my brother. Just make sure you don't burn yourself out. We need you in this fight for the long haul. Michael smiled, feeling a surge of strength from his brother's words. He knew the journey ahead would be long, but he also knew he wasn't alone in it. There were people who supported him, people who understood the fight and who would be with him every step of the way. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of interviews, meetings, and public appearances. Michael's legal team worked tirelessly to ensure that the verdict would be upheld and that the damage done by Karen Thompson's actions would not go unaddressed. Meanwhile, Michael himself took on a new role, one he had never asked for, but one he knew he had to play. He became the voice of the voiceless, speaking at rallies, appearing on news programs, and sharing his story with anyone who would listen. It wasn't easy. Each time he retold the story, he was reminded of the pain he had endured, both physical and emotional. But the more he spoke, the more he realized that his story wasn't just his own. It was the story of countless others who had been treated like they didn't matter, like they were less than human. And slowly the tide began to shift. More and more people joined the movement, demanding justice, calling for change. They weren't just standing with Michael, they were standing with every person who had ever been discriminated against, silenced, or oppressed. But there was still work to be done. The battle for racial justice wasn't going to be won in a courtroom or in a single speech. It would take time, effort, and persistence. And Michael was prepared to give all of that and more. The weeks following the trial were a blur for Michael. The initial wave of media attention had faded, but the pressure didn't stop. Every day brought a new challenge, a new question about the direction of his fight. As he navigated this tumultuous terrain, he couldn't help but feel a certain sense of urgency. The fight was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. One evening, Michael found himself in a conference room at a community center, surrounded by leaders of various organizations focused on civil rights and racial justice. The room hummed with the buzz of conversation as people discussed the next steps. Despite the victory in court, Michael knew the true battle lay in the systemic changes that needed to be made. But where to start? I never imagined it would get this big, Michael confessed to Lisa Turner, his lawyer, who had been by his side through the entire ordeal. I know, Lisa said, her voice steady as ever. But this is exactly what we need. This isn't just about your case anymore. It's about showing people that no one, no matter their race or background, should be subjected to this kind of injustice. We need to make sure your story doesn't become just another blip in the news. It needs to be the beginning of something bigger. Michael nodded, his mind racing. The weight of the responsibility was heavy, but he was resolute. He couldn't allow Karen's actions to be swept under the rug. He couldn't let her, or people like her, continue to believe they could act with impunity. "We're launching a nationwide campaign," said a voice from across the table. It was a local activist named Sarah Williams, who had been working on racial justice initiatives for years. "It's time to amplify your story, Michael. We need to ensure that this becomes a conversation that can't be ignored." Sarah's words resonated deeply with Michael. It wasn't just about his fight anymore. It was about the countless others who had been silenced, oppressed, and marginalized. His victory in court was one step, but there was much more to be done. The systemic racism, the microaggressions, the bias, it had to be confronted head-on. As the campaign gained momentum, Michael found himself speaking at rallies, interviews, and public forums. His words carried weight. He had become the face of a movement that transcended his personal struggle. But with the newfound attention came the backlash. People who had once supported him now began to question his motives. Critics came from every direction. Some accused him of making too big of a deal over a single confrontation. Others twisted the narrative, painting him as the villain. The media was no stranger to sensationalism, and soon the narrative surrounding Michael began to shift. The headlines read things like, "Black man slaps white woman. Is this justice?" Or "The question of self-defense in the age of racial tensions." The discussion quickly turned from the assault Karen had initiated to the question of whether Michael had overreacted. His every move was scrutinized, and the pressure to be perfect, to be the ideal victim, weighed on him like a 1,000-pound boulder. The complexity of the situation was impossible to ignore. On the one hand, Michael understood the nuances of self-defense. He knew that his slap was not meant to harm Karen. It was a reaction, a reflex to stop the attack she had started. But the media, and the public at large, were now questioning whether that was truly acceptable. Was it okay for him to react physically, even if he was provoked? As the days passed, Michael began to feel the mental and emotional exhaustion of carrying this fight. The anger that had fueled him in the beginning now felt like a fire that could easily consume him if he wasn't careful. The more he confronted his detractors, the more he realized that the battle was far from simple. It wasn't just about a single incident in a parking lot. It was about a culture of entitlement, of racism, of prejudice that had been allowed to fester for far too long. In the midst of it all, one thing became abundantly clear. Michael's fight wasn't only against the individual acts of hatred he had encountered, it was a fight against a system that perpetuated and enabled such behavior. One particularly heated evening, Michael found himself in a private meeting with several community leaders, discussing how to address the growing division. He could see it in their eyes, the exhaustion, the frustration, the sense of hopelessness that had begun to take root. He knew that they needed a plan, something that would push back against the tide of hate and make a tangible difference. But what could they do? How could they possibly fight a system that had been in place for centuries? "Michael," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with urgency, "you've already made a difference. But now we need to go beyond the courtroom. We need real change. We need to start getting into the systems that keep people like Karen from ever being held accountable." Michael leaned forward, his eyes burning with determination. "You're right. This isn't just about one person. It's about the whole system. And it's going to take all of us, every one of us, to change it." That night, as Michael lay in bed, he thought about the weight of the task ahead. But in that same quiet moment, he found a renewed sense of purpose. He had been a part of something bigger than himself, a fight for justice, for dignity, for equality. The road ahead would be long and hard, but he wasn't walking it alone. He was fighting for the people who had been ignored, overlooked, and silenced for far too long. And no matter what came next, no matter how many times they tried to break him, he would stand tall. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been oppressed. Certainly. Let's conclude the story with a powerful and uplifting ending that resonates with the themes of justice, resilience, and transformation. The courtroom doors had closed behind Michael, and as he stepped out into the open air, a sense of calm washed over him. The trial had been grueling, and the emotional weight of everything he had endured was overwhelming. Yet, despite the hardship, he had emerged victorious, not just legally, but in his own soul. He had faced injustice head-on, and while the battle for equality and fairness was far from over, he had won this particular fight. But victory wasn't just about the verdict. It wasn't about the courtrooms or the headlines. It was about standing firm, holding his ground in the face of overwhelming adversity, and refusing to be silenced by hatred or prejudice. Michael had shown the world that even when the odds seemed impossible, standing up for what's right was worth every ounce of struggle. As he walked out of the courthouse, a flood of emotions washed over him. His heart still ached from the pain of everything he had endured, but there was also a sense of hope, something he had nearly forgotten in the midst of the chaos. His efforts had inspired people all around the country. His story was no longer just his own. It had become a symbol for every person who had faced the kind of systemic discrimination he had. He smiled softly as he walked through the quiet streets, the sounds of the city bustling around him. It was then that he realized he had become part of something much bigger than himself. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he truly felt like he had made a difference. Months passed, and the campaign to fight for racial justice, sparked by Michael's experience, continued to grow. His story became a rallying cry for people everywhere, not just for those who had endured prejudice, but for anyone who believed in the power of change. Michael traveled from city to city, speaking at rallies, conferences, and community meetings, inspiring countless others to take action and demand justice. As the movement gained momentum, Michael began to see real, tangible changes. Laws were being challenged, policies revised, and most importantly, people were listening. The conversations about race inequality, once whispered in corners and behind closed doors, were now being had openly and fearlessly. The country had begun to wake up. But amidst all the noise and the change, Michael found solace in quieter moments, moments where he could reflect on how far he had come. He thought back to that day in the parking lot, to Karen's taunts and the way she had tried to break him. He thought about the rage he had felt in that moment, the anger that had burned inside him as he realized the true weight of her words. And then he thought about how he had reacted, not with more hate, but with a firm, controlled response. He had set boundaries, not just for himself, but for anyone who would try to cross them in the future. He realized that in that very moment, when he had chosen not to back down, he had taken the first step toward changing the world around him. Michael paused as he stood in front of the newly inaugurated community center, a place dedicated to supporting those who had been victims of racial injustice. It was a place for education, empowerment, and healing, something that, in the past, he would have never imagined possible. But now, here it was, standing as a testament to the power of resilience and hope. He looked around at the people gathered there, families, activists, leaders, and everyday people, each one contributing to the mission of creating a better future. His heart swelled with pride, knowing that the fight he had started had already changed so many lives. In the quiet of the evening, as the sun began to set, Michael sat on the steps of the community center, a gentle breeze brushing against his face. The weight of the world no longer felt as heavy. He had come to understand something powerful through this journey. True change didn't come from anger. It came from understanding, compassion, and the willingness to stand together. He had learned to forgive, not for the sake of the people who had wronged him, but for his own peace. His heart was lighter, his mind clearer. The pain of the past still lingered, but it no longer defined him. Michael was free. He had fought not just for himself, but for a world where others wouldn't have to face the same struggles. As he watched the sky turn to shades of pink and gold, he knew that while this chapter had come to a close, the story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And with that, Michael walked forward, confident in the knowledge that the fight for justice was never a solitary one. It was a collective effort. Together they could and would make the world a better place. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.